Coming up on Chasing the Natty, we're continuing our series analyzing the 2025 transfer portal season, and today we are analyzing our favorite guys out wide, the wide receivers. This position might be the one with the biggest question marks, so where these guys end up might be the ultimate difference maker in CFF 2025. We've got a lot to get through as we'll touch on more than 40 receivers in today's show. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
To go, breaks the tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton caught the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton!
Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye, touchdown Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. As always, we are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus to Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the off season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we do here, head on over to campustocanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We've got content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether that's CFF, Devi, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, then we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. In fact, now, if you want to support the show even further, you can make sure that when you sign up for one of our yearly membership tiers, you use the new promo code NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y, to get 10% off of your yearly membership. Again, promo code NATTY, N-A-T-T-Y. If you can't do that, you can show us some love by doing a lot of other simple things, like leaving a like, comment, subscribe on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, you can leave a 5-star review and make sure you're following the show. Not only does that show us support, but it shows the entire game of college fantasy football in general some support. So if you happen to have any further questions or just want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can always find me in the show on Twitter. I am at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty. And welcoming back to the show for the second time this year, man. I think it's been a while since the last time I've had you on 2 times in a year, let alone 2 times in a month. Welcome back, Mr. Chris Moxley. Mox, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it has been a while. I'm excited to talk wide receivers today. I know, right? It's just I couldn't keep myself away from chit chatting. So I'm excited.
Dude, you've been cranking some stuff out, man, recently. Like you're diving into the weeds on a lot of these transfer guys. Like we're gonna have you back on next week when we discuss some of these FCS transfers. You've been doing some deep dives into that. You got an awesome article over at the Campus Canton website right now. If y'all want to get a pretty much a sneak peek of what we'll be talking about next week, and go check that article out as well. I guess, Mox, like, what are your kind of thoughts as you've been doing research on that, just as like a sneak preview into next week?
Yeah, every year it feels like there's a couple of impact players that come up from the FCS, and Cam Ward was obviously one.
Desmond Reed,
Bailey Zappi, and Des Reed, that's a great one too. A lot of them follow their offensive coordinator, follow their head coach, or something like that. But there's always impact players, right? It's just a lot of people don't watch that level of football. So if we can try to identify those guys early, I think, maybe give you a step up that find some league winners and profit.
Or as Chris K says, they become easy candidates for pumping and dumping early on in the offseason.
Also true.
But we're not talking about that today, Mox. We are finishing up our major positions series when it comes to the transfer portal. That I can come up with a much snappier title than that for the last 3 weeks. But basically, we're going to be covering the wide receivers here today. And Mox, I don't know about you, man. The wide receiver position just in general for CFF this year it just lacks any kind of clarity for the most part, right? Like, you got a couple of guys like Jeremiah Smith, Jordan Tyson, if he even comes back from his injury, well, right? Like, it feels like those guys are surefire bets, and then really everybody else has massive question marks. And I was kind of hoping with the transfer portal, with so many guys going off to the NFL, so many of these rooms kind of opening up, that there would be some clarity kind of being offered by the transfer portal, at least some guys to be kind of excited about with their new spots. And I don't know, man. I'm looking at a lot of these guys, and it feels like we can never get quite that perfect combination of great player, great system. Like, I've seen a lot of great players going to bad systems, seen a lot of good players going to okay systems. I've seen some okay players going to good systems. I'm seeing some bad players going to great systems. And it's like, I don't know. You kind of feel the same way?
Yeah, I mean, we were chatting before we went live talking about how this year of all the years, I think feels the most unknown, kind of at all position group levels, in my opinion. It's just the transfer portal has really done a number on tracking and consistency and whatnot. I mean, we're recording on Sunday, so you're listening to this on Monday. I mean, Ohio State just lost their defense coordinator coming off a national title to take another defense coordinator job. Like, this stuff is it's just wild, and it applies from all the way from the top, the head coaches, all the way down to some of these fringe roster guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you 100%. That the coaching movement's always been there, but it feels like this year again, it's just being that kind of combination of where it's very rare to find guys that are at the same program they were the year before, with the same coaching staff, with a lot of the same pieces around them, right? Just so much changes year to year now with college that it is really hard to kind of keep up with. Now, granted, that's part of the reason why we're here, to help everybody catch up and start figuring out what this is all going to look like. But as we kind of discuss a lot of these rooms today, there's going to be very limited answers that we can offer today, I think. Awesome, Mox. I just saw one of your. Sorry, I'm looking at our show sheet. I just saw one of your notes, and you're making me laugh. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, like I said, there's gonna be very limited answers that are offered here today. You threw me off so badly with that, dude.
I didn't do anything.
Yes, you did. You typed that up. What was I saying? Yes, there's gonna be very limited answers offered today, right? There's so many answers that are gonna have to be sought after during spring camp. So a lot of today is really us pointing you guys in the right direction of like, hey, keep an eye on these rooms. We'll see who kind of emerges from here. There's just a lot of unknowns about how guys are going to translate to different programs and stuff like that. There are guys that I can like, right? But very much so, like, I would not be drafting a ton of these guys super highly just yet, especially in like a money league mock draft, sure, whatever. You just kind of get your feelers out there. So, Mox, shall we get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's head on over to our first team here. And that is really how we're going to talk about these guys here today, is really teams and wide receiver rooms rather than necessarily like individual guys, right? Like there are some teams where they only brought in the one receiver, and we'll just talk about that. But, we'll talk about teams like, Ole Miss, LSU, like teams that have brought in multiple guys. And to me, it just makes sense to talk about them all at once rather than like going through them individually, because they're all going to relate to each other one way or another. One thing I want to be very clear though, this first team that we're going to talk about, I'm going to get some hate, because I fully agree that this is not a team that you should be looking for CFF production. And I was ready to move both of these guys into like our honorable mention section later to kind of briefly talk about, but no, Mox wanted to make the Georgia Bulldog wide receiver room a featurette on today's show. So we are going to talk about them as our first team here. We're just going to go ahead and get this out of the way. I'm not going to sit here and try to hype up either one of these guys going to Georgia. I think it has become very clear that one way or another, Georgia's going to figure out how to not have a 1,000-yard wide receiver on their team, whether that is because their top wide receiver gets injured or they hire Mike Bobo as their offensive coordinator. It's just not going to be happening. So, Mox, I'll kind of let you take the lead on this since you really wanted to dive into this.
How many years has Kirby Smart been at Georgia? 9?
I think he's going into his 9th year.
Okay. Here are the leading receiver yardage in the regular season under Kirby Smart. 709, 552, 604, 396, 769, which is extrapolated during the COVID season, by the way. 498, 519, 649, 530. Which of those receivers do you want to roster? The answer is none of the above, and it's going to be none of the above again in 2025. I am so sick of Georgia wide receivers getting any fantasy attention because they are simply not relevant players at the position. The staff doesn't know how to evaluate them, both in the transfer portal and in high school. They just keep missing. I don't know what it is. It ain't changed in 2025. That is a public service announcement.
I mean, I got nothing else like for you, right? I think your best case scenario, right, for Zachariah Branch, because a lot of people are going to point at his 5-star pedigree. They're going to point at, him fitting well into this system, whatever that means. Like, I think the best case scenario, you're looking at a Dom Lovett style workload, 84 targets, 53 catches roughly. Maybe he can have a better yards per catch than Lovett did this past year. But even then, that was like Lovett was struggling to even get close to 1,000 yards on that. I will say again, if Arian Smith knew how to catch a ball, he might have hit 1,000 yards this past year, because I think he left like 200-300 yards on the field the first half of the season. But regardless of anything else, he still wasn't even the top target. So I'm not going to even pretend that like that would have been a predictable outcome at that point. So yeah, I mean, there's just no reason to really get in on any of these guys. And again, I'll be listening. Like, I think Colby Young coming back will be a big deal for Georgia. It gives them a legit X receiver that they just didn't have this past year. Just from a football perspective, I do think that Branch and Thomas will help Georgia from that perspective. But we're a college fantasy show, and I'm telling you, like, I wouldn't put any kind of stock into any of these guys right now.
I just listed off all of the seasons of the top wide receiver. There was one over 700 in the regular season. Like, the top is getting like between 500 and 600. It just isn't a productive position. It just isn't worth drafting really at all. Like, in my opinion, like, what is Zach Branch going to do? Zach Branch doesn't even know how to run routes downfield. Like, he has to be utilized within like 5 yards of line of scrimmage. I don't know. We're going to hear it again too. People are going to be hyping up Zach Branch, just like you said, because he's a 5-star. But I'm not. Just stop.
I like, hand on my heart right now, I am done. I'm done. It's all right. I think I've probably said this in the past before, but it's just I'm a jaded man, especially if Mike Bobo's offensive coordinator again this year. Like, I just don't know what else to do. Like,
I don't know. I think Zach Branch is a good football player in some capacity. He's not going to be fantasy relevant. Colby Young's not going to be fantasy relevant. Like, it's just the reality of the situation with these dudes. Like Zach Branch is a good football player, not going to be fantasy relevant. Maybe in best ball, you take him as your last round pick.
The only time I am going to be pumping up a Georgia wide receiver at this point will be if we are in week 7 of the season and we got a Georgia wide receiver who's, in the top 20 of wide receivers. At that point, I'll be like, all right, clearly something's different this year, right?
Yeah, when pigs fly.
Exactly. But
it's just not. Yeah, it's just not. I mean, they've had talent at wide receiver too. It's not like they haven't had guys. Like, they've had talent at wide receiver,
and like
they just don't produce offensively.
Well, part of it is also, again, there have been hurt guys, right? Like George Pickens in 2021, I think would have been a clear top wide receiver for Georgia if he didn't tear his ACL, right? A.D. Mitchell goes down the next year for Georgia. Ladd McConkey goes down for an extended period of time in 2023, right? Like, I think that we would have gotten better years out of all those guys had they not gotten hurt. But I'm also not going to sit here and give you an excuse. Guys get hurt all the time in college fantasy. I mean, shoot, look at last year.
This is the top team in the country the last 5 years. Like, you can't produce a wide receiver that's going to get more than 700 yards, even if he's a wide receiver too. Like, what? The staff can't evaluate wide receivers in the portal or recruiting. It's just like it's mystifying to me. They have all these resources and can't do it. I'm not falling for any Georgia receiver again.
All right, let's move on. I'm sure that's enough Georgia wide receiver talk for really the rest of this year. Let's go to a team that has been good to us, and really a system that's been good to us for college fantasy wide receivers, and that is Missouri. Luther Burden is moving on. He will be a first-round pick in the NFL draft more than likely. He finished as the wide receiver 14 in 2023. Very disappointing this last year, though. Finished as wide receiver 45, wide receiver 68 in fantasy points per game. He moves on. Mizzou needs a new slot receiver. Looks like they've got one here in a old transfer portal regular in Kevin Coleman, the former 4-star wide receiver, first at Jackson State, then at Louisville, then at Mississippi State, now here at his 4th stop. Unlike a lot of other wide receivers that have kind of continuously gone to the transfer portal every year, like Coleman's actually legitimately produced it everywhere he's gone, right? So I'm not actually knocking him too much on that front, and that's why I think I'm actually interested in him here at Missouri, right? My big question is, can this offense bounce back? Because right in 2023, Mizzou had a great offense, 26th in the country, 430 plus yards per game. They dropped back big time this year. They were 62nd in yards per game, about 50 yards less per game than they had been. Their running game was very inconsistent for Mizzou this year, and that kind of allowed defenses to get away from the line of scrimmage and to put more effort on stopping the likes of Luther Burden. That's why Luther Burden went from having a 34.7% target share last year, down to a 23.1% target share this year, right? He was just covered way more often. And unless Mizzou can kind of get some more consistent ground game from either, Bo Pribula running the ball or Ahmad Hardy coming in to assumedly be the top running back there. I hope he's the top running back. Otherwise, I don't trust Jamal Roberts or, any of the other guys there. So, again, there's a lot, as we will say with a lot of guys here today, there's a lot of questions here, right? And it's nothing even really to do with Kevin Coleman, although, again, Kevin Coleman, I think, decidedly not as talented as a receiver as Burden was. But if Mizzou's offense can get back on track, I do think that this is a very good spot for Coleman to be in, because we've seen the likes of, Jalen Cropper and Luther Burden do well when this offense is rolling. So, Mox, what are you thinking here? Do you think Mizzou can kind of get back on track this year and that kind of opens things up for Coleman here?
I think the question really is going to be how good is Bo Pribula more than anything. I tend to think he isn't very good. Like, I really think that's going to be a step back from Brady Cook. And I know Brady Cook was hurt last year, but I watch Penn State this year and I'm like, well, they're only doing gadgety stuff with him for the most part. When he finally comes in and actually throws more than 10 passes in a game, like against Wisconsin, 5.8 average depth of target. So he's not pushing the ball downfield. He's a noodle arm. Like he's athletic. His top comp in our database is Nick Marshall. Can Marshall or Trace McSorley support a wide receiver for fantasy production? That's the question that I'm kind of asking. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm being a little bit too hard on Bo. They did pay him $1.5 million, which goes a long way in Columbia, Missouri. But I hate the move for him because from a fantasy perspective, I do think he's good enough to be a SEC wide receiver at a high level. Like obviously Mississippi State's the SEC.
Yeah, he did. I would say he did well in Mississippi State.
Yeah, I think he's a good player. I just wonder, is he going to get 35% of the targets? Maybe he does. And maybe like that's like maybe it's just raw volume that gets him there. I'm a little worried about how good the offense is going to be this year. I think it might take another step back from last year's, which was like average. I think it's going to be below average, which could be a problem.
Yeah, that would obviously be a huge problem because, again, them just being average this year cut Burden down to wide receiver 45, which we both agree Burden's a better wide receiver than Coleman is. My question as well is, like, that my benefit Coleman here is who's his competition for targets, really? Because, again, like, Theo Weiss is gone, right? He's out of eligibility. And then who else is out there on the field with him, right? Mookie Cooper, is he back for another year? Like,
it might be Brett Norfleet. That's tight end. So, that's kind of, I think what we're looking at. It just isn't a very talented room. I mean, they lost a lot and they didn't really replace it with a whole bunch, especially the receiver position. I mean, they really didn't add anybody besides Coleman.
This is going to be a very negative episode today, isn't it, Mox?
Well, I thought quarterbacks was a negative episode when I was on too. So,
you said that during our show, and like I started doing research for running backs and wide receivers, and I'm like, man, like we're gonna sound jolly talk about quarterbacks compared to some of these wide receiver situations going on here.
He's a good player. Coleman's a good player. He is. So like I think you could bet on the talent and just say, yeah, I think he's good. Mm-hmm. I worry about Bo Pribula a little bit and how good that offense could be. Because if the offense is one dimensional and they just run the ball all the time, I don't know. Like, is Coleman going to play the slot position for Missouri? Like, that's the position that's been given value in Drinkwitz offense the whole time. I would assume that
I would say usually that's where they put their best receiver, right? So,
So it's a historically productive position. So it's I think there's a pretty fine line. Like I think he can go really well or really poorly.
As with most of these receivers we'll talk about here today.
Yes.
Speaking of going really well or really poorly, I think that describes both of the wide receivers that are headed over to LSU this year. They got 2 big-time gets out of the wide receiver, out of the transfer portal here. And Barian Brown and Nick Anderson both headed over to LSU. Both of them coming off of pretty disappointing years for very different reasons, right? Nick Anderson injured pretty much the entire year. And then Barian Brown, man, like, what a disappointing career, man. It says a lot when your best year is from when you were a freshman, right? That was back, he is 600 yards, 4 touchdowns as a freshman. And then from then on, like, it's just gotten worse and worse each year. 445 yards in 2023, 361 yards this past year. Granted, Brown's quarterback play that he's had throwing to him has been atrocious, right? Vandergrift this year, Devin Leary's complete crash out the year before. Like, it's not been great for Brown. I understand why he and Dane Key are just getting the heck out of Dodge there, because Kentucky's solution to their quarterback position this year was, hey, let's go grab Zach Calzada, who's definitely never flamed out in the SEC before. But even with the quarterback issues aside, like, I don't think that really excuses Brown for being outproduced by the likes of, Dane Key in each of the last 2 years. And this year is by a lot. Like, Dane Key got over 700 yards in this offense, even with Brock Vandergrift and whoever else they had there at the end of the year. I can't even remember their names. So
Cutter Boley.
You're right. You're right. How could I forget the glory that is Cutter Boley? But I say all of that mostly to say with Brown that, like, I think he has a very attractive skill set. Dude's wicked fast. He's a great returner, but I think people are going to be more in love with the idea of Barian Brown in the LSU offense than the actual reality. I'm a bit rosier on, like, Nick Anderson here, right? Like, it's hard for me not to look at the 2023 season and salivate over the potential of him in this very historically productive program, right? 50 targets, 31 receptions, 725 yards, 9 touchdowns. Dude was averaging over like 20 yards a catch. Like, yes, I don't think he can keep up that efficiency year over year, especially coming off injury here, right? But when I watch him, I do see somebody that could step up really, really well into this system. But that's my question, right? Do I think either of these guys actually break into the starting lineup in 2025? I think there's a legitimate question there, because Chris Hilton's back, Aaron Anderson's back. Aaron Anderson pretty much has that slot receiver position locked down. Xavier Thomas, maybe they can kind of break into one of those outside guys if Chris Hilton and Brian Kelly continue to be at odds and stuff like that. But for now, I'm not really interested in drafting either one of these guys. I'll probably go after the likes of Aaron Anderson or Chris Hilton. What do you think, Mox?
Yeah, I mean, Barian Brown is another. He's like Zach Branch, right? Like they're very similar players in terms of like where they're limited and what they can and can't do size wise, and then like skill set wise. Like these are two the better returners in the country, but when it comes to playing receiver, they struggle. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be interested to see how LSU deploys Barian Brown, because I think if you put him in the slot and like have him work out of there, is going to be way better than having him line up out wide 80% of the time with like a 16-yard A-dot, which Kentucky did this year. Like, that's just not using Brown's skill sets to like the most effective way that he could be used. So if LSU uses him correctly, I think this is a more interesting conversation. He hasn't really been utilized that way the last 2 years. Whose fault is that? Well, Liam Cohen, I mean, got a head coach job, so maybe he knows a thing or two about Barian Brown that I don't. Nick Anderson, we're a year removed from that like crazy productive season. Yeah, I think he has a role in this offense. I'm pretty sure that he lines up out wide.
Almost certainly.
I kind of hard to believe they would bring both these dudes in and not think that they're going to start week one. Like they probably weren't cheap to like acquire the portal, like especially Barian Brown. I bet Barian Brown was like an expensive portal acquisition. Do they plan on doing more at wide receiver with him, or is he like an elite special teams guy? I don't know. Like he's a difference maker on the special teams. So like they could just bring him in for that.
But then at that point, they have 3 different guys that are elite at special teams, right? Because Xavier Thomas the year before was kind of brought in for that role as well. Like he's an elite returner. So
I tend to think Brown is like the best returner the best kick returner in the country.
Oh yeah.
So is I don't know. We just haven't seen production from him. Like, is it good? Like it should have happened already, I feel like, right? If he's a good enough player, you would think that there would be production at some point in his career where he show flashes. I don't think we've seen those flashes on offense.
Not at least
He had
since
that
his
1 3
freshman
touchdown
year.
game, but that was all manufactured stuff, right? Yeah, it's all manufactured. And if LSU uses him that way, I think then you can tell a story. I don't know. Nick Anderson's the more interesting one, I think. Just it's a skill set that I think LSU wants to utilize. Like I could see him getting 8 touchdowns in the red zone this year.
I can very much see him being in a Brian Thomas-esque role, considering how well he lines up on those deep balls. So, like you said, I can tell a story there.
Yeah, he's pretty athletic. I mean, he's got a 66th percentile speed score for a guy who's like 6'4", 220. Like that's a big dude, and he can move a little bit. So I'll be interested to see what happens here because I know there's room for productivity. It's just I don't know where it comes from, to be honest. It's a really hard wide receiver room to project.
Yep. Speaking of room for productivity, I don't think there's a wide receiver room in the country that gives up more production than what we're seeing out of Miami, Florida this year, given the fact that they are losing pretty much everybody. You got Restrepo, George, Brown, they're all off to the draft. Isaiah Horton, who's their wide receiver 2, hit the portal. He's headed over to Alabama. We'll touch on him a little bit later. There's a lot of vacancy in this wide receiver room, and Miami's only gone and grabbed the one guy, and that is a former favorite of yours, Mox, Mr. CJ Daniels here. Does he become the wide receiver 1 just by default in this room? And is that something to be really excited about? One, because Restrepo just got done being the wide receiver 10 on the year. Granted, he was in the slot, but Daniels theoretically should have the QB to get him the ball in Carson Beck here, right? We're not worried about this being an Emory Williams situation, right? What do you think, Mox? How are you reading this situation?
Carson Beck is going to come back and play week 1 from the elbow injury. How much that affects him, I don't know. Like I don't think there's a big enough sample size historically in football to like really say what a Tommy John repair looks like for a quarterback. It's obviously easier than a pitcher. So like, that's your baseline, but we're talking 2 different sports and 2 different types of like throwing the ball.
Exactly.
I think that's going to matter a lot, right? So how healthy and good is Carson Beck? Like, can he still hit some of those big throws? If I was to guess right now, I think Miami's going to add somebody else in the spring window and possibly to someone else.
I would be shocked if they didn't.
I don't think that they can roll into the year with CJ Daniels as their one. I would be really surprised if they did. I also don't know that they think he's their one. I think they might think JoJo Trader is that guy. I don't know that JoJo Trader is that guy. We didn't really see much, but it was a really productive Miami wide receiver room last year. They were 4 deep with like quality players. So
we do know that there's at least one program out there that offered Jeremiah Smith $4.5 million. There's a very short list of programs on God's green earth that can be able to do that. I'm telling you, Miami's one of them. So I agree with you that Miami's probably not done. Not only just working the transfer portal, they're probably causing the transfer portal at some point during this spring.
I would think that they get like a big name wide receiver. So right now, I think CJ Daniels is what, the 1 or 2, at worst the 2. Like he's certainly above Ray Joseph, right? Like it's just not a deep room. It's just not a good room. Period. Like it's not deep, and it's certainly not high end talent wise. Like I like JoJo Trader. I don't know what he's gonna do. I like CJ Daniels last year, but like he wasn't really productive at LSU either. So I don't know what happened there from his really productive season at Liberty to a couple of injuries, but like not a ton of production. Is a really weird situation for Daniel because I really did like him last year. You're absolutely right. I hate saying I don't know on all of these, but like Daniels feels like somebody that pre-spring transfer window is gonna go higher in drafts because he's de facto 1 or de facto 2. I don't know that that's going to be the case on kickoff. So like I have to think they add somebody or 2.
Let's pretend they do make it through the spring and don't add anybody. How do you feel about CJ Daniels at that point? Are you still probably rather drafting JoJo Trader, who probably goes later, I would imagine, in drafts? Because Daniels will probably have more name recognition.
Oh, I would think Trader goes earlier. It'll be interesting, I guess, to see when we get some real drafts and where they go, because I would think Trader goes higher after Daniel's season at LSU. But I'll probably take whoever's cheaper.
Okay.
Honestly, like that will be my approach.
Beck's got to throw to somebody.
Yeah, I think there's a chance that they both, and they're an aggressive passing offense. That's what they want to do. Like they want to push the ball downfield. Like Cam Ward is obviously pretty special, and like we don't know what Beck's going to look like, but they're probably going to throw for 3,000 yards.
Oh yeah.
So like somewhat like there's going to be wide receiver production here. I think you just take whoever's the cheapest, and that might be Daniels. I don't know that that's going to be the case, but I would guess that Joe Trader goes higher. I don't know.
Let's move on to our next group, or not group of guys, really one guy here, but I guess we can throw in the other receiver they brought in as well. But I really want to focus on Chase Sewell here, the wide receiver coming out of East Carolina, headed over to Iowa State. Iowa State also brings in Xavier Townsend, the wide receiver out of UCF. Iowa State, they are losing their top 2 receivers from each of the past 2 years, and this past year was absolutely glorious for us on a CFF perspective, exactly what we would love to see in any system around the country, and that is having 2 top dudes that you just feed over and over and over again, right? Jaden Higgins, wide receiver 13 on the year, 119 targets, 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns. Jalen Knoll, the wide receiver 2, here finished wide receiver 30 on the year. He had 103 targets for 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. Like, you couldn't ask for a better situation from a CFF perspective. There was no other receiver on this squad that got more than 20 targets throughout the year. Technically, if we're trying to look at like who's next up here at Iowa State, right? Carson Brown, Eli Green, those are the next 2 wide receivers that technically are supposed to step up if the transfer portal didn't exist. They got 19 and 12 targets respectively last year, right? So that tells me that when Iowa State's bringing in some guys here out of the portal, they're likely to see the field pretty early. And I think I'm more specifically excited about the idea of Chase Sewell here filling in that role on the outside that Jaden Higgins was very, very productive at. And then Xavier Townsend, I'm not sure how I feel about Xavier Townsend. I don't know if he can really do what Noel did there in the slot, but I am particularly excited about Sewell replacing Higgins' production. What do you think, Mox?
Yeah, you don't have to sell me on him because I'm already bought in. I mean, I think this is a really good 1-for-1 replacement. I mean, Higgins is 6'4", 200. Sewell's 6'4", 200. Coming up from a lower tier of football, transferring in, targeting a guy of that exact same archetype. Like Higgins was excellent last year. It was just consistently producing. Like I don't know that he had like a bad game. Maybe a game where he did catch a touchdown and like he only had like 80 yards, but that's good. Like that's a high floor player, plus a guy who almost had double-digit touchdowns and like almost 1,200 receiving yards. That'll play no matter what.
Yeah.
I think Sewell is an interesting case because with Sewell, he was hurt quite a bit during the year and he played through it a lot, but you only saw like flashes of productivity versus like an entire season of really good play. And I think those flashes are like more the player he is than otherwise. I'm really excited about him. Like, I think he's a super solid player. I don't know that he's as good as Jaden Higgins is. Jaden Higgins is really good, but I do think if he's 80% Jaden Higgins, you're probably happy. And I think that that's not an unreasonable outcome because I don't think Xavier Townsend is any good. Like, I don't know that he's going to be an impact player for the Cyclones. So who else is it throwing to? I like Rocco Beck. I like the offense. I think Sewell steps into that role and is fairly productive. Like I could see 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. I really could. I
agree. Like we're pretty down on most of these guys. This is probably one of the few situations I'm kind of looking at it and saying like I feel pretty good about this transfer. This is a transfer wide receiver that I would be pretty okay with drafting high, even though it is a G5 to Power 4 transfer here. I try to stay away from those, but I legitimately just look at this wide receiver room that Iowa State's got put together here. And it's like, who else? Like, who else is going to step up? And I just, like, guys like Carson Brown, Eli Green, they're going to have to prove it to me because I haven't seen it from them so far. Right? Clearly, Iowa State was very, very happy with their top 2 guys last year. All right. Let's move on to our next group of guys here. This will be over at the Ole Miss Rebels here. We got 2 names coming here. Really 3 if we want to throw in Traylon Ray, the West Virginia wide receiver. I know a couple of people like him from like a dynasty perspective, but really I think the 2 big names that Ole Miss is bringing in here are one, Dejon Stribling, the former Oklahoma State and Washington State wide receiver, and then you're also bringing in Trey Wallace, the former top wide receiver out of Penn State from this past year. Ole Miss, like many of the other teams we're talking about here today, they lose a ton of their top guys, right? They're losing Jordan Watkins, Antwain Wells, and most importantly, obviously, Trey Harris, who was having just a completely absurd season before he got hurt. Mox, don't cheat looking at the show sheet here. Do you know how many yards per route run Trey Harris had before he got hurt, like on the season?
A really good number is usually above 2-ish. He didn't play that many snaps, and he was injured a bunch, but he was really productive when he played.
He played 8 games, by the way.
At least 4, right? At least like 3.5 or 4. Like that's got to be the floor. Like
he had 5.55 yards per route run.
That had to lead the country of anybody who played more than like 100 snaps.
Yeah,
there's no way anybody's close to that.
No, when I saw that, my eyes like bugged out of their heads, being like, all right, I talked a lot of crap for Trey Harris last year in drafts because I thought he was a bad value. Boy, he proved me wrong in every way, and honestly, I think he'll be a steal in the NFL draft. I think he's really, really good. But obviously, we can gush about Trey Harris all day long, and he was set to become the wide receiver 3 based on where his like what his pace was at before he got hurt, right? But outside of Trey Harris' season last year, we haven't really seen Ole Miss wide receivers under Lane Kiffin pop off too much. Like a lot of times we're seeing guys kind of hit their ceilings around 800, 850 yards, which, you know, still can be some really good CFF production in some weeks, but not so much in others. What do we think, Mox? Dejon Stribling coming in, Trey Wallace. Stribling was pretty solid for Ole Miss last year. He had coming off a season, 92 targets, 882 yards, 6 touchdowns, very much plays on the outside role. Trey Wallace coming out of Penn State, where he led Penn State receivers, but to be fair, it's not a very high bar to clear. But this is narrative street. I'm kind of going down here, but I do kind of find it interesting that like after Penn State lost their game to Notre Dame, right? Like the wide receivers in a way were kind of scapegoated. Like they were like Allard didn't complete a pass to the wide receivers in that game. And granted, I'm not going to pretend like Wallace or Evans are like these otherworldly receivers, right? But I do find it interesting to kind of follow these guys. Wallace going to a place like Ole Miss, who have had a productive system for receivers recently. Is there maybe, you know, is he on a mission to kind of prove them wrong? And like maybe that kind of fuels him into having a great season this season? I don't know. There's no statistical backing about that whatsoever, but just kind of a thought I had. What do you think, Mox?
Yeah, I think that the wide receivers on the first snap of the Ole Miss season on the outside is Stribling and Harris, and the slot is Caden Lee. I think Caden Lee is going to be the most productive. He already knows the system.
Yep.
And he had like 800 plus yards last year. Really good player. And only second year too. I mean, I watched Penn State because they're on a lot, right? And I mean, they're always playing in these big games and whatever. I mean, Trey Wallace. He just killed. I felt like he killed me over and over and over with some of these. Like he just wasn't getting separation ever. I just don't know that he's an SEC, like a high-end SEC receiver. Like I didn't think he was a high-end Big Ten receiver.
Mm-hmm.
So are they bringing him in more for depth is kind of the question that I ask. Dejon Stribling, I think, is a better player than he is. And I think Stribling is the guy on the outside who is going to see 80, 90, 100 targets maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're going to throw a bunch. The offense clearly, well, they did take a step back this year, actually, neutral game secure pass rate, which is interesting. I don't know if that's a trend or just a something that they're going to continue doing forward.
Really weird because they didn't have any running backs that like you felt like they could rely on.
I felt like early season Henry Parrish kind of skews that number a little bit.
I guess it's fair.
So I'd have to look at like by game, right? But it was a little bit lower than it had been in the past. I don't know that that's going to be the case moving forward. I don't know that the offense is going to take a huge step back with Austin Simmons either. Like I like Jackson Dart, the player, but like it's Lane Kiffin's system. You're going to throw your heart. I think these two will be productive. I think it's going to be Stribling though. Both, I think, start outside, though. And it's an offense that could throw for 4,000 yards. So,
yeah, I very much see Wallace as a very good Z receiver in an offense like this, right? Like, you don't need him to be able to take over a game or anything like that, but providing that secondary option on the outside, I think he can fill that role pretty decently. I agree with you that if I'm going to take one of these guys in a draft, I'll take Stribling. And you're 100% right. I completely forgot to mention the fact that Caden Lee is back, and Caden Lee, you're right, is a very, very good receiver. So let's move on to another guy here. Another guy that you like here, Mox, that you, or at least you liked him towards the end of the season here. We'll find out if you like his new landing spot. We got to talk about Joseph Williams, the wide receiver out of Tulsa, headed over to Colorado. Much like a lot of the teams we're talking about today, tons of vacancy here with targets, right? Travis Hunter just got done being the wide receiver 2 on the year. He had 115 targets, 1,100 yards, 14 touchdowns. And then that doesn't even include the rest of the wide receiver room that's clearing out here. Wester leaving with 88 targets. He was wide receiver 20 on the year. Shepard, 65 targets he's vacating. Horn vacating 47 targets. So all in all, there are 315 vacant targets in this system. Now, my personal opinion is that with Kaidon Salter under center, I doubt we see the Buffs throw nearly as much as they have the past couple of years, right? As you pointed out here, Mox, when we talked about Kaidon Salter a couple weeks ago, if they do that again this year, that's a misutilization of Kaidon Salter's talent, right? But even still, even if you cut this by a third, right? You got 200 vacant targets in this system. There's room for still a solid CFF receiver here, especially one who plays on the outside, where one, that's where Travis Hunter produced last year, but two, Kaidon Salter, that's where Kaidon Salter targeted CJ Daniels the most when CJ Daniels was a star at Liberty and solid for CFF production. So Williams is coming into a room here where his competition, just from what I could tell, is going to be mostly, the two Millers, Draylon Miller and Amarian Miller. Both guys that I like, but I don't think either one are really insurmountable if Williams is the real deal. So Mox, you like Williams. You liked what he saw at Tulsa. Is he the real deal? Is he a guy that could become the wide receiver 1 for Colorado next year?
So Williams started essentially the 5 final games of the season for Tulsa. Do you know how many yards per game he averaged?
I think it's 120, right?
Not quite. It was 103, but it was over 100. It's pretty darn good.
That's pretty dang good.
Yeah. So this is a player who, as a true freshman, was their go-to impact guy. 158 yards and 3 touchdowns against East Carolina. 126 and a touchdown against USF. He was consistently putting up numbers. Yeah, those defenses are bad, but so is the Big 12. Their defenses aren't great. We're kind of back to the old school Big 12 where the defense isn't very good anymore.
Yep.
I don't know that he's the most talented receiver in this room. I really do like both of the other Millers, Marion and Draylon. I think those are two, really good wide receiver 2-3s. I think Williams is a better player. If I had to really stake my money on who's going to lead this room in receiving, I think it's him. Just it's hard to find guys that are built like that are that athletic. And I mean, he just took over games at times as a true freshman last year, and Tulsa was terrible, man. Cooper Lega was throwing to him, and I'm just he was almost mossing dudes in that ECU game. And I mean, I happened to watch that one live, thinking that this is a player who needs to be in the Power 5, Power 4 pretty much immediately. And so I'm glad he's getting his chance. I don't know how high he'll go in drafts because I think there's a lot of skepticism around Kaidon Salter. And I think rightfully so. But top 10 round pick, ish. I think that I'd be comfortable taking him somewhere around there for sure. I just think he's a really good player. I don't know that Colorado is the sexiest destination. I think it would have been last year, but I don't know. They just don't run the ball. They have no desire to run the ball. So if they're going to drop back and throw it again a whole bunch of times, probably not as many times, but a whole bunch of times, Joseph Williams down there somewhere.
Agreed. Again, he like you said, he had a phenomenal end to the season here. I just looked it up because in my stat sheet for the last season, I have just so I can help catch guys that had great finishes to the year. Where do you think week 9 and on, where do you think Joseph Williams ranked among wide receivers in fantasy production?
Was week 9 that ECU game?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
No, week 9 would have been... Okay, I don't have Tulsa's schedule memorized. Sorry.
How dare you, Mox? How dare you?
He had to be top 20. at least, or like top 15.
Top 10. He was wide receiver 10.
I mean, he had 112 yards, 158 yards, 126 yards in like 3 straight games. That's incredible. That's awesome for a true freshman. That's awesome for anybody.
Agreed.
But a true freshman who like I said earlier, he just took over games. Like, that's a pretty special player. So I'm really excited about him, the player. Don't love the fit at Colorado, but this is just when you like bet on talent. I agree. That's going to win out. And I think he's really talented. You
bet on talent, and you bet that what Kaidon Salter really was missing at Liberty this past year was a true outside threat, right? That if Kaidon Salter can just get a true outside threat, then he can go back to being what he was, and that'll greatly benefit a guy like Joseph Williams.
For sure. By the way, what was Tulsa doing before week 8 where he didn't have a game with more than 23 snaps? Like, he had 1, 14, 2, 11. But
there are
how is he not on the field immediately?
There are some coaching staffs that I know out there that like are afraid of putting true freshmen out there because of just the amount of mistakes that they can make, whether that's lining up in the wrong spot, whether that is running the wrong routes and stuff like that. And especially like with running backs, like I know Georgia, like as much as we liked Nate Frazier last year, there's a reason why he wasn't getting as many carries, and that's because as we saw later in the season, like there's fumble issues like with true freshmen and stuff like that, right? So a lot of them kind of some of them get so stuck in that mindset though that it does kind of block them from a clear talent like Joseph Williams, right?
You're right. Your last year head coach, and it's a true freshman coming in, and you're Tulsa. Like the math isn't mathing on why he wasn't playing.
Exactly. Is your true freshman going to cost you a shot at being 7th in the AAC? Like, bro, come on.
You're a 2-win team, and you're about to be fired. Why not just put a freshman out there? I don't know. Whatever. But love the player. Think he's really good.
Another player that I particularly love after what he did last year, but unfortunately, I really just don't like this landing spot at all for him, is Mr. DT Sheffield, the former wide receiver out of North Texas, formerly before that Washington State, before that JUCO. Been following him around for quite a while. Finally got the great year we wanted out of him last year. Incredible for North Texas last year, especially with Damon Warb's absence for a good chunk of the season. Really, he was great until North Texas's entire offense fell apart in the final 4 weeks, which, by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that in that same time the North Texas offense fell apart, DC Sheffield went from averaging 13.3 targets per game in the 3 weeks leading up to that bye to 5.3 targets per game in the weeks after their second bye, also coinciding with the weeks that they fell apart. I'm just saying, it seems like moving away from DT Sheffield was a bad idea. Regardless, Sheffield's getting the heck out of there. He could have landed another number of fun places, including there was rumors of him going to Oklahoma State, which I would have loved. I think he would have been a fantastic replacement for Brennan Presley. But no, he goes to Rutgers, and Rutgers is kind of an interesting place, right? Like, because Kirk Soraka is the offensive coordinator there, and we know that Kirk Soraka can have a productive fantasy wide receiver 1, right? Think of your Tyler Johnsons, your Rashad Bateman's back during his time at Minnesota, right? And we kind of got a glimpse of that this past year, right? Dymere Miller between weeks 9 and 12, he was averaging 19.9 fantasy points during that stretch. And then he fell off, but then you would have Ian Strong kind of emerge during the last 4 games. He was averaging 16 fantasy points per game. So, there's still a shot at there being a productive wide receiver in the system, right? Miller's gone. He vacates 102 targets. He played in the slot. That's where Sheffield's most likely going to line up. So you kind of think to yourself, okay, maybe Sheffield kind of steps into that role there. But as I just mentioned, Ian Strong had a really nice end to his season here. 10 targets a game, clearly kind of becoming that top guy. And typically, historically, Kirk Soraka's top guy has been an outside wide receiver. Right, so as much as I want to believe in DT Sheffield here, right, I'm not entirely sure that we can just jump in here and say, like, oh, talented wide receiver going to Kirk Soraka, we should automatically jump on him. Don't underestimate Strong is my thought here. Mox, you got some more stuff here. What do you got?
Is DT Sheffield a good wide receiver? Or is he just a really good athlete, like, line up at wide receiver? So 37% of his targets were screens. That was 3rd in the country. 40% were behind the line of scrimmage. He had 10 targets period beyond 20 yards. 5 of them were catches. Those 5 catches accounted for 35% of his entire yardage on the season. And I went back and watched earlier today because I was like, I can't just say, a player's going to not have that, right? You can't just take away their explosive plays. Broken coverage, busted coverage. And just like again and again and again. And I'm like, okay, well, if he's going to get busted coverage in the AAC and do like, I don't know. I was watching him. I'm like, I just don't know this dude can play wide receiver. Like his ADOT was 6.5. And we want to say, yeah, he's going to step to the slot role. That was Demir Miller's role. Demir Miller's ADOT was 13.6. It was more than double of what we had from DT Sheffield. So are they comparable players? Yeah, they'll play the slot. Can Sheffield operate downfield? I don't know. Like we didn't see it. Like he was pretty much exclusively used as a gadget player. How good is he as a wide receiver? Can he take that next step in the Big Ten? Because I do think he's athletic. I do think he's great with the ball in his hands. Is that enough to be fantasy productive? When you're moving from it's cute when 40% of your stuff is like behind the line of scrimmage in the AAC. It's not as cute when it's in the Big Ten. I just don't know that that's a position and a role that's going to lead to fantasy relevance. That's even before we talk about Ian Strong, who I think could have a monster season. Like that's really the outside wide receiver, the X wide receiver has been the one that Kirk Soraka loves. I think Demir Miller was kind of the product of, he's a good player, but I don't know that DT Sheffield is going to see fantasy relevance. I'm just highly skeptical of him being able to do anything that isn't like totally schemed up. And maybe that's what he does, and he has another season like this one. Maybe that's the case. It's just hard to bet on that type of archetype.
See, and the other unfortunate thing is, as much as we kind of like Kirk Soraka's system, he has a loyalty problem with certain quarterbacks that, he meshes well with, even if they're mediocre as all hell, like one Ethan Kaliak-Manis, right? As long as Ethan Kaliak-Manis is behind center for Rutgers, I'm not sure, even if you have a guy like Ian Strong, who, again, you seem to like in terms of the advanced metrics, right? I don't know if that's a quarterback that can really help us produce a CFF relevant wide receiver, even if Ian Strong wasn't there. I don't think he would really be able to help Sheffield or anything like that. Like, overall, as long as the offense is capped by him, I question there really being much value in this system at all. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm probably going to take some shots on Ian Strong. That was a really nice end to the season he had there. But am I going to pay up for it? Probably not too much, just because of that.
I think Strong goes later than Sheffield in drafts. Like I think Sheffield certainly goes higher. I'm pretty confident in that one.
I bet you Sheffield starts, and as soon as this episode and we start talking about it in future episodes and stuff like that, you'll see their ADP switch throughout the season. I bet.
Yeah, maybe. I just, it's so hard for me to look at DT Sheffield's role last year and say this is a player who I think is me. I don't know. Maybe it was just the utilization, like the offense is gimmicky. That's kind of how it works. And there's more to his game because he is so good and so athletic, but like he only had 10 deep targets. So if he's so fast and so athletic, like why wasn't he utilized more there? I don't know. I just have a lot of questions about the player.
A lot of questions for all these guys. Again, that's kind of the theme of today's show. Lots of questions and very few answers for us at this point in the season. Let's move on to our next group here, a team that we don't tend to talk a lot about when it comes to wide receivers, but I think last year, with multiple years under Barry Lunney's system there at Illinois, things are starting to take shape in terms of what this offense for Illinois will continue to look like there with him as the offensive coordinator. And a big part of that was Zachariah Franklin and Pat Bryant being the clear top two targets for this offense, and both being on the outside. They are both gone. They vacate 164 targets between the two of them. Obviously, Bryant's had the fantastic year, 54 catches, 984 yards, 10 touchdowns, wide receiver 23 on the year. Zachariah Franklin, just, I don't know what they were utilizing him as, but it ended up being where he only had like 3 touchdowns, even though he had like 10, 20 more targets than Bryant. It just was really, really weird utilization there. But very kind of similar to Iowa State. 2 top guys, they're both gone. I don't think there's any clear next man up on this Illinois roster, right? Like Malik Elzy is the next most experienced outside wide receiver. He got a whopping 5 targets last year, right? So very similar to Iowa State, I'm paying extra attention to who this team is bringing in from the portal. And they are bringing in one Hudson Clement a guy that has shown a ton of flashes at Western Virginia over the last couple of years, hasn't really been able to put together a full productive season there, partially because of quarterback play, partially because of offensive system, things like that. He comes in. Illinois also brings in one Justin Bowick, a very intriguing option in my opinion. He is a guy that came out of absolute nowhere to end last season for the Ball State Cardinals, right? In 4 games, he saw 33 targets, 20 catches, 383 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Extrapolate that over a 12-game regular season, you're looking at 99 targets, 60 catches, 1,150 yards, 9 touchdowns. This guy had almost 3 yards per route run during his time at Ball State, which, again, do I fully expect it to translate to the Big Ten? Probably not, right? And to me, the even scarier thing about Bowick was, when we only saw him 4 games, he got better as he went along, right? His last 2 games, he averaged 10.5 targets per game, 7.5 receptions per game, 160 yards per game, and almost 5 yards per route run. Like, I don't care what level of competition you're playing football at. If you're getting 5 yards per route run, you are doing something elite at that level, and that is something I think can translate to the next level, right? At least the next level in terms of like going from even the MAC to a power of conference there. I'm intrigued by Justin Bowick. I think that he has the higher ceiling between him and Clement out of these two. So, Mox, what do you think here?
I love Justin Bowick, the player. We had a show on another show on the Campus Canton Network a couple weeks ago. We were talking about our top wide receivers, and he's a top 10 transfer wide receiver, in my opinion. Like I think he's a much higher ceiling than Clement. I totally agree with you. I thought Clement was okay this year, though, given the circumstances. Like, I don't want to dog him too much. I mean, the bowl game was a hugely productive game for him. He had like 170 yards and 2 touchdowns. So, how much of the bowl game is kind of skewing my opinion, I don't know. But Bowick, I don't know this for a fact. I have not been told this. I'm not reporting anything, but he had those games and then sat out and said, I'm entering the transfer. I'm reserve eligibility. Probably had a couple people back channeling him and said, "Hey, man, if you wanna come back, we'll pay you a little bit of money." So I'm sure someone was in his ear about that.
So was he hurt? Was he hurt most of the season? Like, what kept him from getting on the field?
He was hurt at the beginning of the season.
Okay,
and then played those games, was awesome, and sat out to preserve his eligibility, so he could redshirt. So that's kind of what happened at the end of the year. I think. He visited a couple good programs too. Like, this is a player who is highly sought after. I tend to want to draft him in quite a few spots, and I don't know where he's going to go in drafts. He didn't play enough last year, in my opinion, to be a household name. Like, I bet a lot of people don't know who Justin Bowick is, to be honest. Like, even a lot of college fantasy people that like weren't paying really close attention, maybe in some capacity. Like, I think there's a handful of people that just don't know who he is.
I agree.
Not like us psychos, but like, just probably more casual.
Well, even like the psychos, right? Like, if we were paying attention to him, it was more of like in the semifinals, he pops off and you're like, okay, but don't draft. I think I listed him as a do not pick up off the waiver wire, because I'm like, hey, this guy hasn't done anything all year. He's popped off one game. Let's not run and start him in a championship game. And then, well, lo and behold, he had like 180 something yards that final game. And so I had egg on my face for that. But like, that's how we were talking about him. Nobody was really looking at him as like, oh, this is going to be a potential monster for next season or anything.
Yeah, it's really weird because he wasn't a crazy productive wide receiver at Eastern Illinois either. Like, I think he had like 500 yards his top season. And like, that offense is a little like he's not going to have 1,000 yards in that offense. But
no,
it's pretty interesting his trajectory. And Miami of Ohio is a good defense that he did that against. Like, his big game against. I don't know. I was really impressed when I saw him last year. I'm really excited about him, and I think he's going to be pretty cheap in drafts. Not to say that Clement isn't going to be that guy, but if I had to pick one, I would guess Bowick goes later, and I think he's going to be more productive.
Here's the way I kind of think about it, right? I think both of these guys have a chance to be the number one for Illinois next year, and I think they'll both, like, whichever one gets it will be productive. My thought is that Clement, if he's the number one, you're probably looking at, I'd say, probably about 950 and 8 touchdowns for the year. Bowick has that potential. If he earns that top spot, you could be looking at, 1,100, 1,200 yards, 10 plus touchdowns. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, I agree. The thing with Bowick is he's kind of built like Pat Bryant, right? Like he's a big dude. He's like 6'4", 200. Like I talk about a lot of these guys. The one thing that we don't have any athletic data on Justin Bowick. Like, Eastern Illinois kid, Ball State kid, we have a lot of data on the back end with our tools and stuff at Camp Scranton, but nothing on Bowick. I do know that Clement is a pretty good athlete. Does that matter? Does that translate better? I think is to be seen. And I think Bowick is more likely to flame out than Clement is.
Oh, agreed.
Like I think the range of outcomes is very wide for Bowick. I think Clement's probably pretty safe.
Yeah.
I would think that he's probably like a 600-700 yard wide receiver as his floor, which not really fantasy productive, but that's also not going to kill you.
Yeah.
Like if you draft him high.
Yeah, if you picked him up in a best ball draft, like you're going to get some good weeks out of him. Just like you were able to get with Zachary Franklin this last year.
Yeah, they might both be like pretty productive, and neither is like a true wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1. Like that certainly in the realm of possibility. But I think Illinois did a good job replacing their 2 starters from last year.
I agree. Again, you grab a pretty safe guy here in Clement, and then you shoot for the moon with a guy like Bowick, right? Because if both of these guys are home runs, then Illinois is going to be a pretty good team next year. All right, last guy we're going to take a deep dive on here is Easton Messer, the wide receiver out of Western Kentucky. He's headed over to Florida Atlantic, and some of you are sitting here thinking, like, Jared, this is kind of a random one for you to do a deep dive on. You're probably sitting there thinking, like, hey, where's Eric Singleton? Where's some of these other top end guys that have been like big time recruits and everything? Why not do a deep dive on them? I put this in here because this is probably what I'm going to get irrationally excited about. We've already discussed a couple weeks ago just how nice it is seeing Caden Veltkamp reuniting with Zach Kitley in the AAC, no less. Like, that's pretty nice. You know what's even nicer? Providing Zach Kitley with a pretty solid slot receiver, right? Nobody needs to be reminded of, Jarrett Stern's insane 2021 season. We then had to wait a couple of years for Kitley to, 1, get some consistency at quarterback at Texas Tech, but then 2, an actual good receiver in the slot. Sorry, Miles Price, Xavier White, and Dre McCray fans. Like, none of those guys were people that Zach Kitley was going to build his offense around. We finally get one in Josh Kelly, who finishes the year with 123 targets, 90 receptions, 1,000 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Like, last year was proof that when Zach Kitley finally gets his slot receiver, they will be productive. Now, is Easton Messer going to be able to provide that level of talent needed for Kitley to kind of build the offense around him like, he did for Jared Stearns or Josh Kelly? I'm a little skeptical of that, right? But I do think that Messer will be a step above anybody else in this room, right? Like, Messer, compared to a lot of these guys, is, 1, coming off his best year as a Hilltopper, but also 2, like, when you look at some of the other guys they're bringing in, some of the other guys they have left, Messer clearly has the most experience of anybody in this room. Like, it's not even close. Let's actually look at his competition here at FAU, right? In terms of the guys that are already at FAU that could have been competition this year. Amari Hayes, I was a little worried about this because I think Amari Hayes, had he stayed for Zach Kitley, would have been amazing this year. But no, he hopped out. He's transferring to Tulane. Good luck to him. Marlon Johnson, he mostly played out wide and he graduated. Jabari Smith could be an interesting name if Zach Kitley needs an outside wide receiver there. But as I just mentioned, he played mostly out wide. And then Mylon Tucker, the other slot wide receiver for FAU last year, he graduated. Now let's look at some of the other guys that FAU's also brought in at receiver. There's actually a couple of conflicting reports on who has actually been brought in by FAU, but the 2 names I kind of found consistently were, 1, Damon Alford, if y'all remember him from Syracuse a couple of years ago. He had 53 targets at Syracuse and mostly played on the outside, but can be moved around, so I'm a little worried about him. I think he could end up being a pretty solid receiver here. And then they also bring in J.R. Wilson. He had 121 yards at Virginia this past year. He mostly played out wide. So to me, the reason why I'm excited about Messer, the connection between him and Veltkamp, lack of competition in this room, and the historical production of the slot wide receiver for Zach Kitley, and they play in the AAC. Yeah, this is probably going to be a guy that I pump up quite a bit, and we'll see where it kind of goes from there. What do you think, Mox? Am I being irrational about this?
in offense that's going to rank top 5 in neutral game script pass rate, like Kitley has pretty much everywhere he's gone, with a quarterback that I think is probably pretty decent and a wide receiver room that has nobody but Messer. Yeah, like there's a lot there to like. It's really like not, to be honest, it's really not that complicated.
Yeah.
It's certainly a step up in competition. And I don't think FAU is like some world beater in the AAC, right? Earlier today, I forgot they were in the AAC. I thought they were in Conference USA, which kind of tells you how I think about FAU. But I mean, there's a lot to. He's already familiar with the system too, right? Like,
yep.
He's running what Western Kentucky is running this year, and what they run in the past. It's going to translate 100%. Like maybe terminology is different, but like not really. I think there's a lot to like. Messer could certainly use a tan, so it's a good thing he's going to Florida. But I'm kind of excited too, and I don't know that I am not a huge Easton Messer fan. As like,
I don't even know he's that great of a wide receiver, right? Like,
I don't know either, but like I think he's certainly the best in this room. Like Alford is the only one that I think could challenge him.
But we've seen, like you said, a top 5 team in neutral game pass scripts, right? That's a system that can produce 2 wide receivers if all goes well here. Yeah,
and the shine has worn off Zach Kitley for sure. Like, I don't think he was the hot shot he was 2-3 years ago. That doesn't mean the dude's not going to pass a million times and like throw the ball a million times. Like, we talked about Caden Veltkamp specifically for this reason in the quarterback show. We just said the volume is going to be there no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Messer is probably the beneficiary. 110 targets. Does that feel unreasonable?
No, I don't think so at all.
He's one of the. I mean, you like to work on this every offseason, thinking about like the 100 target players or 100 target potential players. Like, I think he's certainly on that list.
I agree 100%. Like as I was putting together my initial rankings for wide receiver, right, I'm like trying to figure out like what's a proper place to put Messer, because like just based on pure volume, like I'm gonna probably rank him pretty highly. Like, and I'm still held back by the fact like I don't know if he's actually that great of a wide receiver, but we'll see.
I think he's the best player that they brought in their entire class in terms of rating when you go to like on 3 and 24/7.
Really? So, higher than Veltkamp? Interesting.
I think it was higher than Veltkamp.
Because I know Veltkamp was pretty far down a lot of the transfer list, which I was kind of surprised by. AKA on 3 and 247 don't know ball hashtag.
Messer 88 and Veltkamp 86.1.
Wow,
that's on 3.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Messer's the top guy they brought in. So I mean, I tend to agree too. Like, I don't know that there's a better receiver than him on the roster, and I don't even like him that much. So
again, that's like that is like the conundrum here, right? Where I'm like, I don't think Messer's that great of a wide receiver, but literally everything's lining up for him to be great here. So
future New England Patriot Easton Messer,
and like it's not like we can look at FAU and say like, oh, they're definitely going to go grab a wide receiver in the portal in the spring, because like what draw is there to FAU right now, right? Like, anyway, let's move.
And they turned over so much on defense too, and that defense was already pretty horrible, really bad. Mm-hmm. And then like it was so banged up for sure, but like now they lost all the dudes that could actually play. So they're certainly going to be in game scripts where they need to pass, regardless.
Could Veltkamp throw 600 times this year? We will find out. Let's go ahead and move on. And we're now in this portion of the show where there's going to be a lot of just, we'll move on pretty quickly through these guys. Got 5 names. I say 5 names, but really 5 teams on the board here that we can discuss real quick. Eric Singleton, transfer out of Georgia Tech, going to Auburn. Deuce Robinson and Squirrel White transferring from USC and Tennessee, respectively. Both of those guys are going to Florida State. Micah Hudson, headed to Texas A&M, as well as Kevin Concepcion, the former freshman phenom at NC State. Disappointing year this past year. He is also headed to Texas A&M. We got Dane Key, headed from Kentucky to Nebraska. And then we also have the 2 Florida International boys, Eric Rivers and Dean Patterson. They're heading over to Georgia Tech to theoretically replace the aforementioned Eric Singleton. So, Mox, out of these 5 teams here, which situation do you kind of want to discuss a little bit?
Um, to be honest, I don't know that there's a lot of fantasy productivity of this group. When I at first glance, I think there's a lot of interesting names. I don't know that productivity is going to be there because a lot of these players are entering offices that either aren't very good or are already very crowded.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the concern that I have looking at this group. But I think the best player for sure on this list is Eric Singleton. I don't know that Auburn needed him, to be honest. Like Malcolm Simmons emerged last year alongside Cam Coleman, and they still have Perry Thompson, who we were fans of, and I think they probably still like. But Coleman is the one there. Like Coleman is probably a future first round NFL pick.
Yep.
What's Singleton's role? I don't know that it's more than like a field stretcher who gets you like 600-700 yards. I think he's going to be a better NFL player than he is college player this year, to be honest. I just don't know the offense is going to be. Maybe Jack Starks can be good enough to support 2 fantasy productive receivers. It's just a really crowded room with a lot of really good receiving talent. So, I best player obviously is going to help that offense for Auburn, but I don't know. I don't know where he goes in drafts either. I don't think he's going to go very high if I had to guess, but he's certainly going to make the room better and probably elevate the offensive ceiling, which helps everybody.
Oh yeah, no. From like a Georgia fan's perspective right now, right? Like I'm not looking forward to the Auburn game next year because again they got Jackson Arnold there, you got Cam Coleman and Malcolm Simmons who are already hard enough to cover in their own right. Now you got to throw in Eric Singleton as well. Like I'm not looking forward to that. I don't think any defensive coordinator in the country is going to look forward to that unless Jackson Arnold completely falls off the face of the planet next year. But I agree with you that like I'm not drafting Singleton next year. Again, even as the one at Georgia Tech, right? He was wide receiver, 86 this past year, 88 in fantasy points per game. So he's not really a guy that can really take over like you would really want him to. One that I kind of find interesting here, and I think this will be a debate throughout the offseason, is what's going to happen here at Nebraska, right? Last couple of years, we don't really think of Nebraska as a CFF darling location for wide receivers, but now that Nebraska has Dana Holgerson calling plays, at least for the foreseeable future, suddenly wide receivers becomes a lot more interesting here. For those of you that need a reminder, Holgerson is responsible for the likes of Tank Dell at Houston, Marquez Stevenson at Houston, David Sills and Gary Jennings at West Virginia. More guys than that, really. Like, he gets production out of his wide receiver, right? So the question becomes, is Dane Key, our former Kentucky top-end wide receiver, who's able to produce with the likes of Brock Vandagriff at quarterback, he now goes to an offense where he'll have Dylan Raiola as his quarterback in a offense that is productive for receivers, right? Can he become the one? Or are we looking at a guy like Ja'Cory Barney, who I know a lot of us here at Campus of Canton like? He finished the year with 69 targets, 51 catches, 427 yards, no touchdowns. Doesn't sound too impressive, but with Holgerson as the play caller, Barney did have 3 games of 10-plus targets. So, Mox, I know you are very close to a lot of the guys that, like, including yourself, who are big fans of Barney. I guess make the case as to which one of these guys is going to get that top spot, Key or Barney.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think those are essentially 2 polar opposite players. Like Barney's a smaller, shifty receiver who's going to get manufactured touches. And Key's an outside guy who you're going to throw like jump balls to. That's like so different in the offense, right? The thing that makes me more interested in Barney as opposed to Key is that Barney isn't just a scheme him up type player. He was at the beginning of the season, 100%. Second half, especially when Holgerson took over, like Barney was running actual routes, like intermediate routes. Like his ADOT went from like 4 to like 11, which is a huge jump in the middle of the season. And a product of like how the offense changed, but not really. He was running actual routes and getting open. I think Barney's a better player. Based on what he did as a true freshman, straight up.
Mm-hmm.
I can see both of them getting 90-plus targets potentially. I don't know that there's another receiver in that room that's not really all that concerning. And I think the offense is going to pass a heck of a lot more. Like, I think that's our expectation, right? Knowing who the offense coordinator is, knowing his history, knowing how they feel about Dylan Raiola. I think all that stuff's going to come through fruition. So you might get fantasy productivity out of both these guys. I think Key's the guy that's going to have the more touchdowns, have a higher yards per reception. But in PPR leagues, like I think Barney's the guy that you want. half PPR, maybe it's a little bit more interesting, but I think Barney's going to get. I just really like the player, to be honest, to the point where I just he's better than Key, and they use him that way. But Key is not a bad player, and he's certainly the guy who's going to be on the outside because they lost Isaiah Nayor and they lost Jamal Banks.
Yep.
And Nayor. He's basically stepping into Nayor's role, like same size, same type of player.
Yep.
Which was productive, right? Like he still had like 65, 70 targets.
Here's the great thing, right? Back in, let's see, I just picked a random year from Holderson's years at West Virginia, 2017 here, right? Gary Jennings, 97 catches, 1,000 yards. Who is this? Who are you? Show yourself. Karan White, also 61 catches, 1,000 yards, 12 touchdowns. Like there's room for both of these guys to be productive, especially again if Raiola lives up to his billing. Nebraska could be dangerous next year. Quick run through the rest of the.
Certainly be interesting. The defense, I don't know how much I love Nebraska next year too. Like I think I'm gonna be pretty high on them. The one pushback that I keep coming back to is I don't think Matt Rule wants to run like a high flying offense all that much. I think he'd rather play more like complementary football. The defense should be all right, and it's a tough conference. Mm-hmm. So I think the ceiling is potentially capped, but I do think it's a really interesting situation.
Quick run through the rest of these guys again. The two Florida State guys, the two Texas A&M guys, Concepcion Hudson, and the two Georgia Tech guys here with Rivers and Patters. One sucks at Rivers, moving up to the Power 4. Like we're losing a top 10 CFF wide receiver there, but also. All 6 of those guys, I think I'm placing in the bucket of I'm going to need to hear a steady drumbeat throughout spring for me to really be looking at them as draftable options. Because just looking at their systems in general, I think all of them are systems where the top target's pretty heavily capped. And you're going to need a special talent to kind of come in and transcend that. And right now, I don't really see any of those guys. Maybe Micah Hudson at Texas A&M, but like that's... assuming that
he's currently not with the team.
That's what I'm saying, right? That assumes that situation gets resolved, right? So,
yeah,
we'll see.
I don't, to be 100% honest, the Florida State transfers, Robinson, White, I don't think either of them are good wide receivers. Like I just think Florida State took 2 dudes who aren't impact players.
That's the story of Florida State's life the last couple of years. They keep taking other programs sloppy seconds rather than going out and grabbing a top guy from another program. Let's see. Let's move on to our next group of 5 here. Let's take a look at the 2 guys at Notre Dame, Malachi Fields and Will Pauling, transferring in from Virginia and Wisconsin. We can also take a look at Isaiah Horton, the Miami wide receiver, was wide receiver 2 for Miami this past year. He's headed over to Alabama. Reginald Virgil, the former Miami of Ohio deep threat wide receiver for them, he's headed over to Texas Tech. We got Caden Robinson, the former Appalachian State top receiver, headed over to UCLA. He is following Joey Aguilar, his former quarterback, over there. And then Baylor is adding a couple of receivers out of the portal here in former Alabama wide receiver Kobe Prentice and Texas State wide receiver Cole Wilson. So, Mox, thoughts? Like pick one team to talk about, I guess. Like which group are you most interested in?
I'll pick the player who I like the most on this list, and that's Reggie Virgil going from Miami to Texas Tech. That's a room that was pretty decimated with transfers and like graduations. I think he's a good player. I was impressed with him when I watched Miami this year. I thought he was like probably their best receiver, and I thought he played pretty well. Given how conservative that offense tends to be. Mm-hmm. I think he could do really well at Texas Tech. So they got rid of Kit. Well, they didn't get rid of Kitley. Kitley took the FAU job.
Yes.
Brought in Mac Leftwich, who had been at Tech the FCS level too. Not 100%, but I think there's split opinions on Mac Leftwich and like how good he is and like if he's really the mastermind behind that Texas State offense. I'm not sure he is, but I don't know that that's a significant downgrade from Kitley either. Like I think that offense is probably just fine. I don't mind that they're losing Barrett Morton. I think Hammond is just as good, if not better. Like there's room for Virgil would be really
I
productive.
thought Barrymore's got another year of eligibility. Did I read that wrong?
Oh, does he?
Pretty sure he does.
I hope not. I just want to see Hammond, man. Dude, like you're gonna have to get your arm taken off after all these shoulder injuries, man.
I'll look it up real quick. You
I mean, I like this situation specifically. I think Virgil's a good receiver. I think the best in terms of like how much the offense is going to benefit is Fields and Pauling going to Notre Dame, because I think those are two really solid receivers. Don't know what the offense looks like next year. CJ Carr is going to be the quarterback. I don't think they're going to bring anybody in. At least that's the rumor.
Mm-hmm.
Fields is a great outside guy, like really productive, basically, regardless of who was throwing the ball. I just think he's a good player, and Paulie's a great slot. Like he'll get you those tough yards. He's not going to be like super productive probably, but I think the overall passing offense is going to be significantly better for Notre Dame.
Is Pauling going to be able to overtake the slot from Greathouse?
I just don't think Greathouse is any good. I don't know. I mean, I know he had two really good weeks to end the year, but like you go back and look at his 26, 28 games, and like there's nothing special there.
I know, but just from like
the busted coverage in the Penn State game, right? Like the dude slipped. It was a good route, but like the dude slipped, so that's a huge chunk play. I don't know. Like Greathouse is probably still like. Do you really want 6'5" Jaden Greathouse running routes out of the slot? Because he can't play outside. The dude can't play outside. The dude is not like a technical enough wide receiver, in my opinion. Maybe he is. I don't know. He isn't athletic. I am not a Jaden Greathouse fan. Is basically
clearly
how I'm trying to say it nice, like in a nice way. Just not his. He's not my bread and butter, and I think that bringing two wide receivers kind of tells you they don't think he is either.
By the way, back to the Texas Tech situation. Yes, Baron Morton does have one more year of eligibility.
Oh my gosh!
So we'll see how that plays out.
He's hurt all the time. Just preserve your body, man. Don't you be able to lift your grandkids up? Let Will Hammond take the job.
Yeah, hold clipboards and babies instead of football, Morton. And I will say, Mox, like, I don't know if you touched on it, but Caleb Douglas and Coy Eakin, it seems like, are back for Texas Tech as well.
Oh, I thought Eakin had exhausted eligibility. Okay, that's good to know. So
I think that we're looking at potentially, again, there's just being a split targets between those three. Eakin still has, let's see, does he have 1 or 2 years of eligibility? He might have 2 years of eligibility. Yes, he has 2 because he redshirted 2022.
I must have been thinking of somebody else. I got all the eligibility for Texas Tech way wrong then. I don't know what I was looking at in terms of the Rad Raiders. So I still like Reggie Virgil. Probably don't like him as much as I did about 10 minutes ago, and I thought that it was a little more decimated. But they do lose Josh Kelly and Micah Hudson, right? Those are two like impact players.
Well, yeah, for sure, right? And then the other thing is the rumored NIL for Virgil coming to Texas Tech was like $700K. Like, to give you an idea, like Don Lovett was brought to Georgia for like $600K. Like, Texas Tech dropped a bag for Virgil to come to this offense. Like, you don't drop a bag like that and just not use this guy. So we'll see what they got planned.
Well, happened last year at TCU, so we'll see.
Fair point. And then quick thoughts on Caden Robinson going from App State to UCLA following Joey Aguilar. That excite you at all, Mox? Or?
Good player. I think probably not going to be all that productive. I don't know. I don't really have strong opinions about UCLA. I feel like do you think, what is his upside this year? Is it like more than 800 yards?
I think, again, if you're lucky, you kind of get him back to where he was 2 years ago when he had finished like wide receiver 50.
Are they going to put him back outside? Because like the move to the slot was strategic. So I'd like to know where he's going to run, because there's a difference in terms of valuable routes.
I mean, Tino Sinceri, again, we don't have a ton of data on him, right? Because he didn't even really call plays for Indiana last year. But like when he ran the offense for Indiana last year, Elijah Surratt being on the outside, that's where they had their best receiver. So if Caden Robinson's their best receiver, and I don't think that's a huge assumption considering their UCLA's wide receiver room's garbage. Like, if we can get back to what Surratt did last year, I think you're feeling pretty good. But I don't know. What about Isaiah Horton, wide receiver 1, 2, or 3 for Bama next year?
Certainly not 1. I'll tell you that much.
I know. Just throwing that out there.
I mean, he could be the 2. I mean, who else? I mean, Jeremy Bernard comes back for another year, right?
Yep.
So I don't know that he's better than Jeremy Bernard. So 2, 3, maybe.
Yeah, that's. I was excited about this transfer at first, and then I kind of realized that both Williams and Bernard are back, and I was like, yeah, I don't know how high Horton's ceilings really is at that point.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, let's move on to our next group of 5 here. J. Michael Servant, former UCLA wide receiver, he is headed over to Florida. Devontae Ross, former top 10 wide receiver for CFF this past year, he is transferring out of Troy. He is going to Penn State, where he hopes to actually be able to get separation and catch a ball for them. At least that is what Penn State's narrative on why the season ended the way it is, or why the season ended the way it did. They went and grabbed one of the top guys in the portal for that, right? Jalil Farouk, a former Oklahoma wide receiver, headed over to Maryland. Arizona's adding 2 pretty decent, West Coast guys here in Chris Hudson and Luke Wysong. Luke Wysong, obviously a very good wide receiver for us in PPR points last year for college fantasy. Chris Hudson, all right at Washington State there. And last but not least, we got another Oklahoma, at least a former Oklahoma wide receiver here in Andrell Anthony. He is headed over to Duke. Mox, I'll throw 2 out here that I want to go a little bit more in depth on. One, I would say to all the people who have Devontae Ross shares in C2C and or College Dynasty, I will give you a quick moment of silence, because that is a very unfortunate landing spot for him. Just a good G5 player gone bad when it comes to Power 4 transfer. Jalil Farouk at Maryland interests me a little bit. Obviously, he hasn't exactly been the healthiest the last couple of seasons, but Maryland loses Ty Felton, who was wide receiver 8 last year. He had 143, I repeat, 143 regular season targets last year. They also lose Caden Prather, who had 87, so you're looking at, 230 targets vacated just between the 2 of those guys. Farouk comes in. Should he stay healthy, I think he pretty quickly slides into one of those outside spots. And then his main competition becomes, Octavian Smith, maybe. Shalik Knotts, are they better options than Jalil Farouk? They also add Caleb Webb, a former blue chip wide receiver coming in from Tennessee. And then maybe, does any of that matter with Justin Martin at quarterback, right? Like, I don't think Martin's a really inspiring option at quarterback. But then again, I would have said the same thing about Billy Edwards last year, right? So, Mox, how do you kind of read this Maryland wide receiver situation? Because I think this is somewhere that could fly under the radar just a little bit for people.
I tend to think Martin's more of a rusher than he is a passer, so I don't know what the play calling is going to look like. But there's so much production loss from this room that someone's going to have to do something. It's probably Farouk. I mean, I don't think the Shalik Knott is better than Farouk now. He's certainly the most experienced guy, right? I think there are a couple people who are, I don't know if they're still holding out NFL hope, but some people like him more than I do. I don't know. My concern with Maryland is that it's just nobody is the answer. I'm afraid. I like Justin Martin, the player, but that's a fantasy upside, not necessarily passing upside.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting.
Well, the good news about bad quarterbacks is a lot of times they get overly dependent on one receiver that they constantly look for. So maybe.
It's not impossible. For sure. You're right. I didn't like Billy Edwards coming into the year either, and he certainly outperformed expectations. So is MJ Morris not back?
I think MJ Morris transferred again.
Oh.
So, let me look it up. I think he Coastal, I think it was. Yeah, he transferred to Coastal.
That's kind of interesting. Huh. That's kind of interesting. Something to keep an eye on, I guess.
And then the other room that I'm kind of interested in here is these Arizona boys with Hudson and Wysong going there. Mostly because I was like, okay, 130 targets vacated by Ted McMillan. Obviously there's some opportunity there. Problem is, both Hudson and Wysong were slot guys at their respective schools. And I was like, okay, well, maybe somebody gets...
They both played outside, at least 40% of the time.
Yes, but can you do that? Can you do that in the Big 12, right? Because look at the size of these guys, right? Hudson, he's 5'11", 175. Wysong, 5'10", 184. Jeremiah Patterson, 5'10", 175. Like, you got 3 guys here with all slot builds. Which guy are you moving to the outside here? Like, I think probably Wysong might be your best option. Because, again, like, he's gotten the most experience on the outside, but, like...
You put so Hudson played outside 50% of the time. Wysong played out wide 34% of the time.
Okay.
Maybe it's the other way around. I think they could both play for what it's worth. Like I think you could. There's a lot of versatility in that room, and I think that's probably what they needed at Arizona. I think Wysong's a good player, so he's the guy that I think I want to be drafting from this room. At the same time, no, Fafita was really bad last year, and I'm not sure Arizona is. I think Arizona's probably the worst team in the Big 12 again, and maybe that's a good thing because their defense is going to be terrible, and you're going to see a lot of shootouts. A little concerned about the play of No Fafita last season, and he had Tet McMillan. So what happens when Tet McMillan's gone, and they don't really have anybody else?
I think it's, again, like, No Fafita was solid under Jed Fish. I really think that he just did not translate well to Brett Brennan's system. Right.
I think I think it's possible. I think the loss of Jacob Cowing as like a slot receiver, like a safety blanket slot receiver, really hurt that offense. Like I think his loss was huge.
I can believe it.
And so I think Wysong could step in and like certainly be the best slot receiver they had from last year. Like, love Jeremiah Patterson. It's not happening, buddy. I think Wysong is the answer. But then they don't, like, who are they going to throw to on the outside? Like, they don't have alpha. Like, I don't know that you want Wysong to be a wide receiver 1.
Especially at the power.
I think he will be.
Like, yeah, do you feel good about that at the power 4 level? He was obviously great at the G5 level with New Mexico, but can that translate there? Quick thumbs up or thumbs down. J. Michael Servin at Florida. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Are you drafting him?
Maybe late, but I don't know.
I
think
think
the ship's still done. J. Michael Servin.
To me, he's a stopgap because they lose both Badger and DK to graduation. Like, I'll trust that Trey Wilson will get all the targets, and he's the guy to draft in this room before I go with Sturdivant again. And then Andrew Anthony going from Oklahoma to Duke. They lose Moore. They lose Eli Pankel. That vacates 171 targets. Theoretically, they're getting an upgrade at quarterback. You taking a shot on Andrew Anthony here?
He's another one of those guys where I'm like, I don't know that he's any good anymore. Like, I think I was interested in him when he first transferred from Michigan, but
yeah,
like, how many years are we going to have Andrew Anthony breakout party and then have to cancel the party?
Yeah,
that's a concern that I have. But like you told me, and I many times on many shows this offseason, Duke passed a bunch, and now they have a better quarterback. Like you said, I mean, Darian Mensah and Malik Murphy are tiers between those types of players, like not even the same realm. Maybe Duke gets a little bit done. I don't know. They added where's he from?
The Harvard wide receiver?
Yeah, Harvard. I knew he was an Ivy Leaguer. Cooper Barkate, who I think I would draft over him, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, that'll be somebody we take a look at when we talk FCS transfers. Let's move on to our next group of wide receivers here. Cam Vaughn, the wide receiver out of Jacksonville State. I just realized I got the graphic backwards. He's going from Jacksonville State to West Virginia, not the other way around. We got 2 wide receivers headed to Colorado State in Lewis Brown the 4th. He is going home. And then Kojo Antwi, a former 4-star wide receiver, formerly at Ohio State, basically did nothing while he was there. He is transferring down to Colorado State. We got 2 G5 studs in Krishan McCray and Omari Kelly headed over to Michigan State, rip to their value. And then 2 former Washington State wide receivers here in Carlos Hernandez and Chris Barnes, following Jake Dickert over to Wake Forest. And then Trayvon Rudolph, initially transferring from NIU to San Diego State. He changed his mind. He is now going to Toledo. So, Mox, I want to start with the Colorado State guys because I'm interested in like where we go with this system this year. Because are we kind of done chasing Norvell's system, right? At least until he can get some better quarterback play. Because this last year at wide receiver was just an abject disaster. If like Torrey Horton gets hurt, And then nobody else in that wide receiver room could step up, right? Mari Winfield, 60 targets, 338 yards, excuse me. Jamari Pearson, 54 targets, 386 yards. Caleb Goody, 40 catches, 428 yards. Like, nothing was going for this offense in passing last year. Again, part of it was that Braden Fowler-Nicolosi is not a good quarterback. He will not improve. No. And I'm scared that we're stuck with him for a while. I'm kind of hoping that Brown is being brought back to Colorado State because they're just like, please, please, please. You were one of the only good things working for us when Torrey Horton wasn't here. So please come back. But otherwise, like, I don't know. I'm getting sour on Jay Norvell and his system. Are you kind of feeling the same way, Mox?
I just wonder, like you said, how much of that is quarterback play. Like, he's still running a really aggressive air raid system. Like, that's not really going to change. That's kind of like just like who he's been going back to Nevada, right? I think I don't know if he's still the offense coordinator, but he was the offense coordinator when Norvell took the job. So he wants the air raid routes to be the basis of the offense. Mm-hmm. So that's good. You need a quarterback to run an air raid offense that's going to throw 65% of the time, 70% of the time.
Yep.
I don't know that Fowler-Nicolosi is that guy. I would love to see them turn somewhere else this year. Just to try maybe something else. The offense just you have Torrey Horton, then you don't have anything else really. Like, that was it. Mm-hmm. And I like Lewis. I don't think anything of Kojo Antwi. But I like Lewis Brown fine. I think he's a fine player. So, and you have to think that if Colorado State paid up to get him back, that they want to utilize him in some capacity, because
Agreed.
Colorado State has resources. Like, that's a pretty well-resourced program. So I don't think they're just taking guys to take guys. Like, I think they probably wanted Brown.
No, I agree. What about Carlos Hernandez and Chris Barnes headed over to Wake Forest following Jake Dickert? Not only are they following Jake Dickert to Wake Forest, so they're going to be familiar with that coaching staff, right? They bring in Rob Ezell as the new offensive coordinator there, who just got done being the offensive coordinator at South Alabama. Granted, I'm not exactly sure how much of that was, Applewhite's system, how much did Ezell actually have control of that offense? But regardless of anything else, like, under Ezell's watch, Jamal Pritchett finished as the wide receiver 4 on the year, 119 targets, 1,126 yards, 9 touchdowns in the regular season there, finished as the wide receiver 4, right? Hernandez played outside last year, but he was slot his freshman year. Chris Barnes, when he, in his limited action, did mostly see action in the slot there. Are you interested in either one of these guys at Wake Forest?
So I wonder if Jamal Pritchett was like just that guy, or it was a product of the offense. I think it's maybe a little bit of both. Because, we're talking about D.T. Sheffield earlier, and a guy who is utilized close to line of scrimmage and whatnot. The guy above him was Jamal Pritchett. Like, Jamal Pritchett had a ton of close to the line of scrimmage work last year. Tons of screens, tons of manufactured touches. That's the kind of player I want to target in this offense. So is Hernandez going to move back to the slot? I hope so. Yeah. I think that'd be good. I actually like the quarterback situation at Wake Forest. I think Deshaun Purdy's a good quarterback. I think there's something there with him. I think he's got the size. I think he has the arm. Questionable decision making. I think thinking that he could beat out DJ Lagway, but
we love a confident king.
I'm just interested in this offense and I think that player that I want on offense is the slot receiver, or the one who's going to get those touches close to line of scrimmage. So usually the slot receiver. I hope it's Hernandez. I think he can do both. And he was obviously hurt last year, but I think he's a good player.
He was pretty involved when he came back as well. They didn't ease him back in or anything. Once he got back out there, I think he was pretty quickly the second or third option a lot of weeks. So.
They're bringing the outside wide receiver from Montana too.
Ooh,
which he's pretty good. I'm not really sure how I would rank at first, but I know they added him, and that's not a bad player. So I kind of need to see how it shakes out in spring. But I am tentatively interested in the Wake Forest offense, something I probably wasn't saying last year.
All right, couple of yes/no questions here to finish out this page here, Mox. Cam Vaughn, fantastic year or finish to the year here. 91 targets, touchdown in the conference championship game. 14 targets, 9 receptions, 183 yards, and a touchdown in the bowl game for Jacksonville State. He follows Rich Rodriguez from Jacksonville State to West Virginia here. Yes or no, he is the top wide receiver for Rich Rodriguez's system next year, and yes or no, is that a CFF worthy spot?
I think he's got to be the favorite to be the wide receiver one. I think he's the best. I think he's the best receiver on the team. Like he was good when they went to him last year. It's just
took him a while.
There's the service academies. Yeah, there's the service academies who run at like 80, 85 to like 90% of the time, and then there's Jack State like right there. So is there going to be enough offense to really sustain a fantasy productive receiver for the whole season? I don't know, because I don't think Rich Rod's really moving away from that. What his bread and butter?
Yes or no, Christian McCray or Amari Kelly, are they fantasy relevant next year?
I think McCray has a better chance to be. I just think he's a better player than Kelly is. But, I mean, I don't think either going to unseat Nick Marsh. Wide receiver 2 for Aiden Childs. I'm not sure how much value that brings. But I like Aiden Childs, and I think that he's surrounded by enough weapons to succeed if he's a good player. I don't know that means fantasy relevance, though.
Trayvon Rudolph, he goes to Toledo. They lose Erwan Newton. He was wide receiver 16 last year. Junior Vandeross is back. Toledo needed another receiver. Yes or no, Rudolph fits that bill. And yes or no, that means Rudolph is a fantasy relevant wide receiver next year.
He's got to stay healthy. He's had quite a few injuries, and he's been in school for a long time. But he's familiar with the conference, and he's done really well at that level in the past. So, I think there's certainly upside there. Did he enroll at San Diego State, or he just committed there? He couldn't have enrolled.
He had committed. I don't think he had ever enrolled.
That kind of tells me that he wasn't highly sought after.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Toledo kind of panicked and said, we need a guy.
Yeah.
No offense to San Diego State, but you lose a bunch of stuff. I'm not sure that you are a very well-resourced program.
Mm-hmm.
And that's who wanted Rudolph? I don't know. Kind of, maybe he saw Sean Lewis and said, hey, you can make me a 1,000-yard receiver. That's possible.
True. And then he got there and saw Jordan Napier and said, nah, I'm out. All right. Next group, we'll try to get through these guys.
Yeah. He saw the quarterbacks were
Yeah, nope. All right, next group of receivers here. Keegan Johnson, former wide receiver out of Kansas State, formerly before that of Iowa. He's headed over to New Mexico. I'll get to in a second why I think he's kind of interesting. Donovan Green, boy, if he could ever stay healthy, he might be something, but now he might be something at Virginia Tech instead of Wake Forest. Minnesota is throwing out a bunch of transfers grabbing a bunch of transfer wide receivers from the portal between, Javon Tracy, Logan Loya, Malachi Coleman. Malik Benson, boy, he's still convincing programs that he is worth something because he's headed to Oregon after a disappointing stint at Florida State. And then Prince Strawn, wide receiver out of Boise State, he is headed over to USC. So I'll start with my thoughts here on Keegan Johnson. I think this is one to kind of keep an eye on here because New Mexico hired Jason Eck, the former head coach of Idaho. And his top outside wide receivers, if you interpolate them to 12 games, because, FCS plays more than 12 games, so I just kind of cut back their production a bit here, just to give you an idea of, where they would finish among wide receivers typically for fantasy. Under the last 3 years, under X system, in 2024, the top outside wide receiver saw 115 targets, 68 catches, 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns. In 2023, 120 targets, 85 catches, 1,140 yards, 8 touchdowns. 2022, 118 targets, 90 catches, 1,300 yards, 17 touchdowns. There is room for there to be a very epic wide receiver production here at New Mexico next year, especially with Eck bringing with him Lane, one of his quarterbacks from Idaho. Not that Lane got a ton of playing time or anything like that, but somebody familiar with the system. Keegan Johnson, a guy that's been around for a couple of Power 4 programs, maybe we get a big fish, small pond situation here where, you couldn't cut it at the Power 4 level, comes down to the G5 level, especially a team like New Mexico that is just completely devoid of talent for the most part. I think he's somebody that could be very interesting next year. And maybe New Mexico is just too poor to do anything in 2025, right? They just lose too much. But we also saw last year that, even a guy like Brockman Mendenhall was able to get a good system going there in year one. Maybe Eck can do the same thing here, and Keegan Johnson can be a big player for them. What do you think, Box?
This is tough for me because I actually really like Jack Lane, the quarterback. I think he's a good quarterback. He's a pretty aggressive downfield passer. He was hurt basically I don't say the entirety of the year, but the entire middle of the season. I don't remember exactly what his injury was. I think it was a shoulder or something. It doesn't really matter. He'll be healthy. He's aggressive. He likes to target his outside guys for sure. I just don't know what this offense ceiling is because they are really efficient, but they don't pass a ton. It's honestly a good offense, and I'm excited for the hire at New Mexico, but I don't know. I just wonder what the ceiling is here, because Lane is not a rusher, right? So it will not be the same situation that with Dampier, where his groundwork kind of monopolized the entire offense. I could see something with Keegan Johnson. I just don't know that he's as good as some of the Idaho wide receivers they've had. Like last year, they had Jordan Dwyer. Jordan Dwyer is a way better player than Keegan Johnson is.
Yeah.
That's more my concern. But I like Jack Lane. I like Idaho, what they've done offensively. I think they were top 15 offense in explosiveness and efficiency the last 3 years. It's a good offense. We'll see. But it is there's somebody that I'm going to draft out of that room, and it might be Keegan Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he and the entire wide receiver room is let's hear what spring what comes out of spring. Because I think somebody there could emerge. And the defense is terrible. So
I agree.
They're going to have to pass a lot.
Yeah, as of right now, Keegan Johnson to me is a grab him the last 5 rounds of your draft of a 30-round draft kind of deal.
I don't hate that at all.
So, let's see. What else we got here? Minnesota, again, I got a bunch of names listed up there, but I will say Malachi Coleman's the only one who plays out wide consistently. With Daniel Jackson gone, Minnesota doesn't really have a clear next guy up there. Are you interested in Coleman at all, Mox? Or get the PJ Fleck outside wide receiver 1? Big shrug.
He couldn't get it done. He couldn't cut it at Nebraska. I don't know that he's going to be able to cut it in Minnesota.
Speaking of not cutting it, we're both done with the Malik Benson train, right? I think we're he's decidedly wide receiver 2 at best, right? Not even.
I can't believe Oregon took him. The dude can't play wide receiver. The dude's just a freaky athlete. And you know what? Maybe they just throw him a bunch of tunnel screens and that's it. That's all they do.
Could be.
But I mean, we have 2 years where he's just highly inefficient. It's just yards per route runner are bottom percentile for somebody who's running that many routes. I just don't think he's a good receiver, period.
And then Prince Strong, I think, pretty decidedly third fiddle, right, to Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane. I don't think there's a world where he really overtakes either of those guys, right?
Yeah, probably not. I like Strong, the player. But
he's a great third option for a Power 4 team, for sure. If he was...
It's funny because when I was looking at his stats, in my head, I'm he probably had a couple hundred, 500, 600 yards, was really efficient. And he really wasn't.
Yeah.
He didn't play that many snaps. I mean, he played a lot of snaps, but he didn't start a lot of games. It was really weird.
Yeah. Probably why he's transferring.
He didn't start after week 6 or 7. Week 7 against Hawaii. That was his last start of the year. So that's kind of weird to me. But USC taking him tells me that they think they have something there, especially athletically and size-wise. I mean, freaky kind of potential.
All right, last group of receivers here. We'll try to get through these relatively quickly here. Amari Evans, another Penn State wide receiver. He's headed over to Washington. I think that's interesting. Could be maybe a Giles Jackson replacement. Giles Jackson, 103 targets last year. Even outproduced Denzel Boston. Evans mostly played out wide when he was at Penn State, but kind of moved to the slot sometimes. But with Jeremiah Hunter and Boston both kind of returning, the only option would then to be put Evans in the slot. Jalen Lloyd, Another guy I'm kind of interested in here, he's going from Nebraska to Oklahoma State, very much a deep threat guy, deep outside guy, going to a receiver room with literally nobody else at Oklahoma State because, Presley's gone, Stribling's gone, Owens is gone. Like, I'm kind of intrigued because it's competition coming in from the transfer portal is Shamar Rigby, who I like at Purdue, but like he didn't really do much despite starting most of the year. And Sam Jackson, the former Auburn wide receiver and Cal quarterback, he's still eligible somehow. And then in terms of what's already there in the receiving room, really the only person I could really think of that could potentially challenge Lloyd at this point is an old friend of ours, Talon Cetron, who led the team in yards per reception last year and yards per route run. So maybe he comes back, but I think Lloyd has a good opportunity there. Christian Leary going from Georgia Tech to Western Michigan, just kind of an interesting big fish, small pond kind of guy. So could be interesting. Same with Sheldon Sampson, former 4-star wide receiver at LSU. He's transferring down, going to Louisiana, reunites with Walker Howard there, right? Who knows? And then I just kind of threw all of the Mississippi State wide receivers in here together. Anthony Evans out of Georgia, Aiden Williams out of Ole Miss, Jaron Glover out of Michigan State. And I just kind of threw on the note here of like, somebody's got to step up here, right? So, Mox, which guys do you find the most interesting?
This is a tough list.
There's a reason why we're like these guys are like the last 5 we're talking about today.
So I think Jalen Lloyd is a really good piece in an offense that can stretch the field. Like the dude's got legit speed. I don't know that he's more than that. That's my concern with him.
Mm-hmm.
They also brought in, what's his name? I can't remember what his name is now, but I don't know that he's going to get starting snaps. Like I've looked at a couple Oklahoma State depth charts, and he's not always the guy starting, and he can play inside or outside. So that gives him some probably a little bit better potential, but I don't know. Like, are they even going to throw with Hosseini? Like, that's what I wonder. They're like, are they going to let him just run around and do fun stuff all the time? Like, that's what I would do.
Yeah, it is. I have no clue what to expect from the Oklahoma State offense just in general next year. Because again, you lose Ollie Gordon, you lose, not that Alan Bowman's like a huge loss or anything like that, but questions at quarterback now, questions at receivers. Could this be the year that Mike Gundy finally gets fired?
I honestly thought it might have been last year, but I bet the buy. They restructured contract, right?
They did restructure the contract.
So that tells me that he is on his last legs, and he doesn't want to adapt. He has no interest in adapting.
No, absolutely not. What about Mississippi
State? He does not like the NIL situation. I'll tell you that much.
Oh no, absolutely not. What about the Mississippi State guys here? Any of these guys stand out to you, Mox?
Not really. I guess Jaron Glover is probably the most experienced one in that room, or at least the one that has had the most run. Like I don't know that Jaron Glover is like a special player or anything. Anthony Evans, I think at one time had potential. I don't know that it's really ever going to materialize for him. Same with Aiden Williams.
Yeah, a lot of potential.
We're like digging at the bottom of the barrel with these days.
Here's the thing, Mox. I'm absolutely gonna get a DM from Nate Marquise or Chris K, and they're gonna be like, "You went 40-something wide receivers deep, and you didn't mention this guy." And I'm gonna be like, "But you had time for Anthony Evans going to Mississippi State, or you had time for Christian Leary going to Western Michigan." I guarantee you, I'm gonna get a DM like that if they made it even this far in the show. Yeah. With all that being said, that's it, man. We've dug deep on these once again. Another 2-hour show in the books, man. But lots of great stuff here. Before we get out of here, again, Mox, as I mentioned before, you're doing a lot of great articles over at campusofcanton.com. Everybody should absolutely go check them out. Your articles are available to everybody. You do not have to be a subscriber to read them. So, I'm telling you, it's absolutely worth your time. And while you're over there, again, make sure you sign up for a membership, yearly membership specifically, and use that promo code NATTY, NATTY. Anything else you want to say before we get out of here, Mox?
No, just for your CFF CFF Dynasty drafts. Keep an eye out for our rookie guide that comes out, I believe, March 1st. So it's getting pretty close.
Yes, sir. Right around the corner, and our CFF team's gearing up to start writing up some supplemental pieces for that as well. So we will have that for you guys. With that, we have come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys for listening. Like I said before, if you have not already, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast, make sure you follow the show. Leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you check out the rest of the Campus Canton podcast networks for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll be back here next Monday. We'll be talking some transfer tight ends and diving into some of these FCS transfers that are coming up. We'll have a great time. With that being said, until then, really appreciate all of you guys and hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.